The date was Saturday, June 3rd, 1944. Sergeant Artificer Gertin Witter was lying in the grass among the dunes on the Atlantic coast of Normandy, scanning the sky through his binoculars. The midday sun was hidden by a haze, but it was a warm day, as indeed one had every right to expect on the Kenton Peninsula at the beginning of June. But storm clouds were gathering. It looked as though the fine spell was at an end. The roar of the long Atlantic breakers was punctuated by hammer blows. A party of the 1262nd Anti-Coastal Artillery Regiment was emplacing a captured French gun outside Roselle. "Hey, Witter! Bagged anything yet?" Second Lieutenant Wager called up to the dunes. "No luck so far," the sergeant artificer replied. In the same instant, however, he dropped the binoculars onto the hark beside him. With a single swift movement, he rolled over on his stomach and snatched up his French shotgun. Its twin barrels described a slow arc in the sky from right to left. Bang! And again, bang! A white ball of fluff came tumbling down. Witter dropped the gun into the grass and raced off. "Got it?" his comrades asked when he returned a minute later. "Here it is," the sergeant artificer said, grinning. "Look," and he showed his comrades a dead pigeon. "Is it loaded?" asked Vega. "Certainly ha, Lant, here we are." Witter held out to him the tiny metal capsule which he had detached from among the plumage. He opened it. Inside was a scrap of wafer-thin rice paper. Written on it were numbers and letters, and the message was signed with a tiny drawing of a fox. "Last time it was a raven, or a magpie, or some other such bird," said Witter. He was an old hand at the game. "Take it up to the chateau," the lieutenant commanded, "and be quick about it." Witter pedalled off on his requisitioned bicycle along the road from Leur to Shore to regimental headquarters in the little chateau of Sville to hand over the carrier pigeon with its message for England, a message for British intelligence from the secret network of agents in France. These messages disclosed the locations of the gun emplacements and pillboxes that the Germans were building along the coast and inland, the identity of the army units stationed in the villages, and anything else that might be of interest to the enemy's intelligence. Shooting down these flying postmen had become a popular sport along the whole coast of northern France. Of course, only a few of them were shot down. Countless pigeons were safely reaching their lofts along the south coast of England. But of those that did not complete the journey home, one was particularly valuable. Its failure to return was to cost the lives of many American soldiers. We shall hear about that at present. On the morning of Monday, June 5th, Major Friedrich Hayne, the intelligence officer of the 84th Corps in Saint-Lô, noted in his log the report from the 79th Division about the intercepted carrier pigeon with its secret message. He put the aluminum capsule with the coded text aside in order to show it to General Marks on the next day, June 6th. He would send it by courier to Central Intelligence in Paris. He was not to know that on the following day he would be busy with far more important things. The Major glanced at the large window on the far side of the room and out to the cathedral with its impressive spires. He looked at the sky, which seemed to portend bad weather. Then he turned back to his work. Situation maps, air raids, enemy signals, more and more paperwork. Like Major Hayne at 84th Corps headquarters, staff officers everywhere, in the chateau around Paris, in Brittany, in Normandy, over in Belgium, in the Pas-de-Calais, in Holland, and in southern France, were on that June 5th, 1944, studying reports and information about enemy air incursions and bombings, reports from the coastal sectors, and about the progress of fortification work. But their main interest was in the weather situation, for everything hinged on the weather. The weather was the be-all and end-all. It would decide the question that was worrying them all: would they or would they not come? It was that question that kept them all where they were, the staff officers, the generals, and the 58 divisions west of the Rhine. They were all waiting, all absorbed by the one problem: when would they come? And whenever a general asked, "Any risk of an enemy landing today?" his staff officers would first of all look at the weather chart. After all, the enemy had to come by sea, and there certain rules applied. If, for instance, the wind was higher than force 4, and visibility less than 3 nautical miles, no landing operation was possible. Likewise, rain with a low cloud ceiling would rule out that air cover which was indispensable to any armada attempting a landing. Nor would the enemy come sailing in at the height of the day. They would certainly come before daybreak in order to approach the coast as closely as possible under cover of darkness. Hence, it would have to be either low tide or high tide at dawn, according to the tactics General Eisenhower had chosen, a landing at high water or at low water. That, of course, was anybody's guess. On the whole, the German staffs tended to believe that he would land at high water, with the tide running behind him. That was one of many mistakes. What then was the weather like on the Normandy coast on June 5, 1944? Reassuring, very reassuring. There was a wind of force 5, 6, and a rough sea of scale 4, 5. There were heavy clouds, many places had drizzle. All headquarters from Paris to Brest were looking forward to a quiet night, preferably with a bottle or two of Chablis. Cheers. The men in the gun emplacements, the strong points, and the defence posts along the many miles of coastline had no Chablis. At most, they had Calvados, the local apple brandy. They were looking out across the nocturnal, mist-shrouded sea, keeping watch. In the concrete dugouts along the Este, the men were lying on their wooden bunks. It was hot and damp and sticky in these modern cave dwellings. The men were talking, or else they were voicing their homesickness and resignation in true army style by singing the hit of the dugouts of Western Europe, the Lily Marlene of Normandy. It was called Cute Little Bus Conductress. 75 miles from the Seine estuary, on the east coast of the Kenton Peninsula, Strong Point No. 5 was held by a platoon of the 3rd Company, 919th Infantry Regiment. Second Lieutenant Arthur Y. was making his tour along the foremost trench on the crest of the dune. A lookout was manning the scissor telescope. "Anything, Janka?" he asked. "No news, Herr Leant." Janka stepped up to the telescope. Across the foreshore, he looked out towards the sea. The night was black. Rain clouds were shrouding the moon. Only now and then would it break through a gap in the clouds, the round disk of a full moon. For a moment it would steep the beach and the land beyond, the hedgerows, the orchards, and the willow trees, in its pale light. For a few seconds it would be mirrored in the water of the inundated valleys. Then it would hide again. "They won't come in this weather," said the lookout. The lieutenant nodded. They would not come in this weather. Furtively he touched the wooden balustrade of the observation post. Then he returned to the stone building of Strong Point No. 5, known for short as Widest Stan's Nest. "They won't come in this weather." That also was the verdict of the meteorologists on June 5th. Rear Admiral Henner, Naval Commander Normandy, sent an urgent inquiry about the weather situation from his headquarters in Cherbourg to the chief of his meteorological station at Kapel Ahag. He was uneasy because the first week of June favoured a landing from the point of view of high and low water times, moon phase, and long-term weather prospects. Moreover, his radar officer, Lieutenant Vzan, had reported a striking amount of activity on his screen during the preceding night. It could be a major concentration of ships, had been his opinion. The radar signal had then been lost, evidently through interference. However, the weathermen sent Admiral Henner a reassuring signal. Rough sea, poor visibility, wind, rain, likely to get heavier. We didn't even get our usual air raids. The unpromising weather prospects had been further confirmed by a report that a convoy intended for Brest had not sailed because of the weather. "And what's it going to be like tomorrow?" the Admiral asked. "There is little prospect of short-term changes in the weather during the next few days," was the reply of the meteorologists. Henke visibly brightened up. "That means," he was thinking aloud, "that the various conditions of tide, moon, and general weather situation necessary for a landing here in northern France won't coincide again until the second half of June." In Le Mans, at 7th Army Headquarters, Colonel General Dolman likewise asked his Chief of Staff, "Anything likely to happen today?" Major General Pemsel had already inquired from Naval Group headquarters in Paris. He was able to quote to his army commander the reassuring forecast of the meteorologists, though he added a little doubtfully, "If only one could rely on those weathermen." The army commander had probably not even heard that last remark. He wanted to believe that they would not come, for he too realized the value of time gained if they did not come that day. He calculated several weeks would elapse before they would be likely to try to effect a landing, and time was what he needed. Time to set up more obstacles on the beaches, to build more strong points, and to bring up more coastal guns. Much remained to be done before that 600-mile-wide coastal gate to Europe was securely barred. "Then we can hold our commanding officers' conference and the subsequent map exercise in Rennes tomorrow morning," General Dolman said to his orderly officer. "See that everything is arranged. Every divisional commander is to bring with him 2 regimental commanders. I shall expect the gentlemen in Rennes at 10 a.m. tomorrow." The 7th Army Chief of Staff was a mistrustful and cautious officer. In spite of the reassuring forecast of the meteorologists, he was uneasy at the thought that for 2 days the entire front line of the 7th Army was to be without its most important commanding officers. He therefore had a signal teleprinted to the various divisional commanders, urging them not to set out on their journey to Rennes before daybreak. If, against all expectations, a landing was attempted, then surely it would come in the early hours of the morning. By daybreak, everybody would know where they stood. Needless to say, this advice was not much use to the divisional commanders a long distance away from Le Mans. Over those bomb-pitted roads, they would never get to Rennes by 10 a.m. From the battle headquarters of General von Schlieben's 709th Division near Valognes, for instance, it was a trip of 120 miles. For General Falley of the 91st Air Landing Division stationed at Châteauhaut, the distance was not much less. For this reason, von Schlieben, with the consent of 84th Corps, set out during the afternoon of June 5th, and Major General Falley drove off at nightfall. "Nothing's going to happen in this lousy weather," he said to his Chief of Operations. Even Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commander of Army Group B, the military overlord of the entire northern French coast, had allowed himself to be tempted by the bad weather to combine business with pleasure. On the morning of June 5th, he had left his headquarters, the 1,000-year-old chateau of the Dukes of La Rochefoucauld at La Roche-Guyon, for Germany. He intended to pay a brief visit to his wife at Herrlingen, as her birthday was on June 6th, and then drive on to Berchtesgaden in order to report to Hitler. It was to be a very important report. He was going to ask for reinforcements for his coastal front. Rommel intended to talk the Führer into transferring 2 additional armoured divisions and 1 mortar brigade to Normandy. In his diary is the entry, "The most urgent problem is to win the Führer over by personal conversation." Rommel was worried about the situation on the coast. Unless reinforcements arrived, both for the coastline and for his operational reserves, the chances of throwing the enemy back into the sea once he had gained a foothold were slender. Rommel needed more and better divisions. He needed units with operational experience. How were his divisions of elderly reservists, the East battalions made up of former Russian prisoners of war, the battalions of men with ear or stomach complaints, and the overage crews of his coastal batteries to resist a large-scale attempted landing supported by naval guns, aerial bombardment, and subsequent close combat? The average age of the men of the 709th Division, for instance, was about 36. That of the American GIs in the assault divisions, which were ready and poised across the Channel in England, was 25. The average age of the naval gun crews along the invasion front was as much as 45. Among them were men of 56 and more. These figures spoke for themselves. But was this disadvantage not offset by the insuperable Atlantic wall, by that protective shield of concrete, steel, guns and mines? Was the coastline not thick with menacing concrete fortresses equipped with powerful naval guns? And was the foreshore from Brest to Ostend not littered with ingenious death-dealing obstacles? The answer, unfortunately, was no. In the summer of 1944, the Atlantic Wall existed only in the Pas de Calais. For the rest, it consisted merely of a string of widely spaced strongpoints, some of them only half finished. Only a few of the heavy batteries were adequately protected or even equipped. Most of the equipment consisted of captured enemy guns, totally unsuitable against naval targets because of their caliber and their lack of fire control equipment. What worried Rommel more than anything was air power. He knew from the African campaign and from the fighting in Italy for the beachheads at Salerno and Anzio what enemy superiority in the air meant. He knew from El Alamein how fighter bombers could pin down entire armoured divisions. Neither Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief West, nor General Gerd von Schlieben, commanding the armed forces centred on Paris, had any comparable personal experience. Rommel had that experience, and on it he had based his plan of defence ever since November 1943, when he was appointed commander of Army Group B and thereby overlord of the coast of northern France. His basic principle was simple. The front line was on the beaches. The invading troops were to be engaged at once on the very coast, at their beachheads, to avoid long and costly movements to the battlefield. "The enemy is at his weakest just after landing," Rommel declared. "The troops are unsure and possibly even seasick. They are unfamiliar with the terrain. Heavy weapons are not yet available in sufficient quantity. That is the moment to strike at them and defeat them." Hence Rommel's insistence. All available weapons and troops must be employed at that moment. The enemy must be struck at his first step on land, or if possible, even while still at sea. Instead of defence in depth along traditional lines, Rommel demanded a linear defensive structure close to the coastline. Heavy armaments, artillery, tactical reserves, everything was to be employed to its full extent to engage the enemy on the coast. Rommel even called for a forward build-up of the armoured divisions, so that they would be able to intervene from the very outset in the defensive battle on the coast. That was his active defence. His passive defence was the system of foreshore obstacles that he had invented. It was his old idea from the African campaign outside El Alamein. He had planted his Devil's Gardens, extensive barrier zones with infernal obstacles, mines laid in 3 tiers, booby traps touched off by tripwires, and harmless-looking stakes with tremendous explosive charges. The same idea, only more elaborate and on an even bigger scale, was to be used to defend the French coast against an invading fleet. For the foreshore below the high water mark, he invented ramming cones with mines and steel saws, designed to wreck all landing craft. From the old Czech defences came the so-called Czech hedgehogs. He ordered steel girder obstacles to be brought to the west by the hundreds of thousands and to be dumped on the beaches. He invented the most intricate mine constructions, the Nutcracker mine on posts linked by wire to be triggered by the pressure of a landing craft against a stake, and mines to be detonated by gunfire. Inland, in fields, meadows and forest clearings, he ordered tall stakes to be driven into the ground to prevent air landings. They became known as Rommel's asparagus. He was indefatigable in his inventiveness. To overcome the resistance of the older officers, who were not impressed by these newfangled ideas, he ordered, "I hereby forbid all training and demand that every minute be used for work on the beach obstacles." He knew what he wanted. It was on the beaches that the fate of the invasion would be decided. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and General Geyer von Schweppenberg held the opposite view. They wanted to fight the decisive battle far behind the coast. They wanted to keep the armoured forces and the tactical reserves well back in the interior of France, in order to cut off the attacker as he advanced, in accordance with the orthodox strategic principle of encircling the enemy to destroy him. Rommel's strategy was, "Don't let them land." Rundstedt and Geyer's motto was, "Let them come." In this clash of opinions, Hitler made a decision that rejected General Geyer's plan, but fell short of Rommel's requirements. The armoured divisions remained outside Rommel's command. True, they were not quite as far inland as Rundstedt and Geyer had wanted, but neither were they as close to the coastline as Rommel considered necessary. The Field Marshal turned these thoughts over in his head as he was driving to Herrlingen on the morning of June 5th. Together with his chief of operations, he was planning how he could induce Hitler to change his defence strategy and, above all, how he could get him to reinforce the divisions in northern France, if need be, at the expense of the garrisons in Norway, southern France, or the Channel Islands. Rommel knew that his strategy of front-line defence on the beaches could not be realised if a single division, for instance, General von Schlieben's 79th, had to defend a front of 40 miles. As long as there were 2 or 3 miles of no man's land between one defence post and the next, it was impossible to prevent an enemy landing, let alone throw him back into the sea. A well-tried rule of thumb said that a front line of 6 miles was as much as a division could hope to cope with. Rommel, of course, was aware of that. He therefore saw only one solution. Somewhere the European front had to have some gaps. Frederick the Great's principle was still valid. He that would defend everything will defend nothing. All this Rommel hoped to be able to explain to Adolf Hitler on June 6th, but the opportunity never came. By June 6th, it was too late. Events had started to move, but as yet no one suspected anything. On the other side of the Channel, Allied security officers were guarding the date of the invasion, the secret of D-Day. A large army of German intelligence agents was trying to discover that secret, and they succeeded. Even before the first aircraft took off from England on D-Day to drop their bombs over the Normandy coast, the German command in France knew that the invasion was on. Proof of it in black and white was literally lying on their desk, but they did not make use of it. This is no fairy tale or film plot. The full sensational story may be found in the official American history of the invasion. Evidence can also be found in the war diary of the German 15th Army. Treason and skillful espionage had unveiled the great secret. No German field officer, no officer commanding a strong point, and no ordinary trooper need have been taken by surprise by the Allied invasion on June 6th. Here is the well-nigh incredible story of why, nevertheless, they were caught unawares. The Allied command had set up in France a widely ramified secret organisation for collecting information and carrying out sabotage. Experienced regional chiefs were in charge of the various sections. Among these, the Alliance of Animals was one of the most efficient information-gathering organisations. Its members bore the names of animals. The transmission of information was by radio or by carrier pigeon. In addition to the spies, there were the saboteurs. In some areas, these organizations were linked with one another. In others, they were kept strictly apart for security reasons. The sabotage organizations existed throughout the whole of France. They were divided into regions, complete with regional chiefs, section leaders, and thousands of collaborators. Their task was ceaselessly to disrupt the work on the German defences, and above all to hold themselves in readiness for the main blow on D-Day itself. 1/4 of an ounce of sugar, just 3 lumps, dropped into the water of a concrete mixer was enough to rob 200 weight of concrete of its strength. If calcium combines with sugar instead of with carbon dioxide, a readily soluble calcium saccharate is formed. Thus, if a member of the French resistance succeeded in getting himself employed by the Germans near a concrete mixer, he could cause extensive damage to the defences by dropping quite small quantities of sugar into the mix or into the stored materials. The concrete shield of a gun emplacement or the roof slab of a dugout might be sufficiently weakened to crumble like sandstone if hit by a shell. But that was only one aspect of these sinister activities. For D-Day, the London headquarters of sabotage organisations in Europe had worked out a special plan, the Green Plan. A few hours before the invasion, 571 French railway stations and junctions were to be destroyed, and 30 main lines blocked at a single blow. Simultaneously, the Tortoise Plan was to be put into effect. This envisaged the disruption of telephone lines and the blowing up of crossroads, bridges, and viaducts. It is obvious that the main problem in this kind of work was the signal for immediate action. After all, it was impossible to inform the numerous section leaders in the various regions of France of the top-secret invasion, date several days in advance, quite apart from the fact that this date might have to be postponed at the last moment, as it in fact was. Thus the idea was conceived of giving the order by radio. The chiefs of the sabotage organizations were instructed to listen carefully to the French transmissions of the British Broadcasting Corporation on the 1st, 2nd, 15th and 16th days of each month, and to watch out for a code message. This code was the first phrase of Paul Verlaine's famous poem about autumn. If it was transmitted, that is, if it was read out among a multitude of other messages, this meant that the invasion was imminent. From that moment onward, all transmissions had to be continually monitored for the second half of the verse, the second Allied B message. If that came through as well, it meant the invasion would start within 48 hours. From then, all sabotage chiefs had to stand by for detailed orders, likewise to be given by radio codes for their specific operations under the Green Plan and the Tortoise Plan. It was a well-thought-out scheme. However, the Abwehr, the German counterintelligence service, got hold of the secret. Too many Frenchmen were in the know, and one of them was on the German payroll. He betrayed to Admiral Canaris, the head of the Abwehr, this militarily most valuable poem in the whole history of literature. Canaris treated it as a precious gift. He soon knew the first verse by heart. Les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne blessent mon cœur d'une langueur monotone. That was the fateful verse that Canaris entrusted to the chiefs of his monitoring posts as their most carefully cherished secret. Thus it came about that not only the regional chiefs, the section leaders, and the active saboteurs of the sabotage organizations in Europe were listening to the British Broadcasting Corporation transmissions for that poem by Verlaine, but also the German counterintelligence service, but also a team of specialists at the Signals Centre, Colonel General Smouth, 15th Army Headquarters in Tooting, were not confused or distracted by the countless messages which were merely blinds. They knew the correct text and were waiting for it. Their patience was rewarded. The war diary of the 15th Army, which held the sector between Seine and Meuse, contains 5 entries under the date of June 5th. The first of these states that the Signal Centre monitored the first part of the Verin verse Le Long d'Eon on June 1st, 2 and 3. The second entry, logged at 9:15 p.m., states, "Second half of message, blessant mona d'une monotone recorded." The third, fourth and fifth entries at 9:20 p.m., 10 p.m., and 10:15 p.m. respectively almost reflect the excitement of the writer. They state that the sensational news, the great secret, had been passed on to the commander of the 15th Army, to Oberbefehlshaber West, the Commander-in-Chief West, and to all General Headquarters. This included the 16th Anti-Aircraft Division, the military commanders in Belgium and France, as well as to Army Group B and to Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of the German Armed Forces at Rastenburg in East Prussia. By 10:15 p.m. on June 5th, the High Command of the German Armed Forces, as well as Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Naval Group Headquarters in Paris, and Rommel's Army Group had been informed that the invasion was imminent. As yet, no shot had been fired. The bombers were just about to take off from their bases in England. The transport aircraft with their airborne troops were taxiing out to the runways. Pilots and paratroops believed their secret to be safe, but their secret had long been betrayed. But there was no need to worry. It was to make no difference. A great effort had been made for nothing. The first victory had been thrown away by the German High Command. Admittedly, Colonel General von Saloth immediately placed his 15th Army on full alert, but that army happened to be outside the scope of the impending events. Apart from him, nobody did anything, nothing at all. Army Group B did not alert its 7th Army and allowed it, hours later, to fall an unsuspecting victim to the most powerful attack in military history. The 84th Corps, against whose coastal divisions the 1st Airborne and naval landings were directed, was left to be caught by surprise. Neither Admiral Henner, Naval Commander Normandy with his vital coastal batteries, nor the radar stations were alerted. Rommel was not immediately recalled from Herlingen. For 14 decisive hours, his army group was left without its head, without its directing and controlling force. Its chief of staff, General Speidel, was left to his own devices. General Jodl at the Führer's headquarters might be excused for thinking that Field Marshal von Rundstedt would give the alarm, but the Field Marshal did not do so. He did not do so simply because he did not believe the report. The standard American history of the invasion quotes one of his staff officers as saying, "As if General Eisenhower would announce the invasion over the British Broadcasting Corporation." The report was simply disbelieved, averse by Vane ridiculous. Why, on the other hand, the staff of Army Group B should likewise have been infected by this lordly contempt for unconventional methods of warfare and have failed to alert its corps and divisions remains a mystery. Thus, the triumph of the German Abwehr was in vain. The night of June 5th was spent in routine activities, in a carefree and sometimes even convivial atmosphere. Strong formations of enemy bombers approached Cherbourg. German officers and signallers were sitting in the underground battle headquarters of the naval commander, as on any other night. Every now and then, Sub-Lieutenant Gunnar Blum, the Situation Room and orderly officer, would come down from Henner's little villa, which was sited exactly over the underground tunnel housing the battle headquarters, and ask for news. But there was no news in Cherbourg. Each time, Blum was able to return above ground reassured. In the villa above, Admiral Henner was sitting with his staff officers in the spacious room, whose windows during the day offered a wide view over the sea. Now the heavy curtains were drawn and the tables were laid for a light meal. Admiral Henner was entertaining visitors. Following a concert given by a troop welfare party, the Admiral had asked the performers and officers back to his house. Among them were two young women, Ursula Bram, the imperturbable naval auxiliary who kept Sub-Lieutenant Blum's operations log, and Senior Lieutenant Wiest's wife, the pianist of the visiting concert party. Frau Wiest saw the piano in Henner's mess room. It was well tuned. She played a few bars, and like a nostalgic dream of bygone days, Schumann's Papillons softly filled the air. Time seemed to stand still, but it was not standing still. An orderly was threading his way through to Blum. He was wanted on the telephone. When the lieutenant returned, he leaned over to Henner. "Very heavy air raids on towns and roads in the coastal area, Herr Admiral. Other strong bomber formations are reported from the Calvados coast." Henner nodded his head. The war was demanding attention. The war had no time for Schumann's Papillons. The Admiral glanced at his watch. The time was 11:30 p.m., strong bomber formations. He could not get the phrase out of his mind. In the air, the enemy was coming and going as he pleased, and who was to stop him? Only that day, Henner had learned from Paris that the second group of No. 26 Fighter Squadron, which was commanded by the successful Commodore Prillet, the mathematician of the air, had been switched to the south of France for rest. The first and third groups were on their way to Reims and Metz. That left the entire fighter defence in Normandy with about 27 aircraft. A squadron consisted of 3 groups and had approximately 93 aircraft in the hands of No. 2 Fighter Squadron, the Richthofen Squadron. But Field Marshal von Rundstedt had always reassured his generals, "On the third day after an invasion at the latest, you may count on the support of 1,000 aircraft." And Rundstedt had referred to Hitler's firm promise, "On the third day after D-Day at the latest, I shall render the invasion front capable of breaking the Anglo-American air superiority." Thus it came about that Field Marshal Sperle, according to the operations log of June 5th, was commanding an air fleet which on paper possessed 496 machines, but of which only 319 were operational, 88 bombers, 172 fighters, and 59 reconnaissance aircraft. "I can't keep my fighters in France waiting for an invasion," Goering had said. "I need them for the defence of the Reich," and so he had employed his fighter units against the Allied bombing offensive on Germany proper. As a result, the 2nd Air Corps had no aircraft at all available in the West. The idea was that on D-Day they would be switched from Germany to the airfields in the battle zone. Those were Admiral Henner's thoughts, and he no longer enjoyed his little party. He went down into his tunnel headquarters, which, though no more than half finished, was already a highly elaborate and absolutely safe command post. In the right-hand tunnel, a field hospital had been installed and equipped. On the left were the situation and map rooms and the various command posts. There were direct telephone lines to every battery on the coast. There was even a direct line to the Führer's headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia. The duty officer passed the Admiral the reports that had come in from the observation posts of the Navy's coastal batteries in the sector from the Bay of the Seine to the Normandy Islands, loud engine noise of approaching bomber formations, light reconnaissance aircraft penetrating over a broad front, target markers being dropped behind the front. Even the small observation post by the Quo lighthouse reported overflights by Pathfinder aircraft and transports. "A real field day," Henner grunted. He was feeling a little uneasy. "Bloom, just run upstairs and ask them to wind up the party. Make my apologies to Frau Wiest, but I rather think we may have to listen to a different kind of music at present." The party was over. The guests were driven back to their quarters. Thus, the night of June 5th to 6 passed in a strange mixture of moods, in a sombre atmosphere of unsuspecting gaiety. An uneasy suspicion crossed Field Marshal Rommel's mind. He was not the only one attending the birthday celebration in the Panzer Lehr division of Lieutenant General Fritz Bollain, which was deployed in the area of Nantes LRO between T and Laon as an OB Commando de Wehrmacht reserve. 2 officers of the 102nd Regiment were hosting a joint birthday party at their quarters at Vibre. One of them was born on June 5th and the other on June 6th. It seemed like a splendid opportunity for an early start and a late finish. The Burgundy was excellent, and everybody was having a wonderful time. Bin's division was an excellently equipped fighting unit, the only panzer division of the Wehrmacht to be 100% armoured. It had 260 tanks and 800 armoured tracked vehicles. The non-commissioned officers were hand-picked and trained with thoroughness. Their average age was 21.5. Colonel General Garrion, Inspector General of Armoured Forces, once said during the post-mortem on a CL map exercise with this division alone, "You will throw the Anglo-Americans back into the sea." Garrion had deliberately emphasized, "Remember, your objective is not the coast, but the sea." When the birthday party at the 92nd Regiment was in full swing with the Burgundy flowing freely, the men tuned in to Soldat and Sender Kal, the British propaganda transmitter for the German forces. There was usually some hot jazz between the news items, but that night Second Lieutenant Beaumar was unlucky. Kal evidently had no time for merrymaking. He tried the British Broadcasting Corporation, but there too he found no music. Urgent voices were reading out messages, presumably intended for the French resistance, in an unintelligible flowery code. "John loves Mary," "has no fear of colours," "the dice are on the table," "the beetroot has been peeled." This was followed by advice to the French civilian population on how to behave during air raids. They were to leave the towns where German troops were stationed, especially headquarters towns, and take shelter in the open country. "Leave the towns," the radio urged. For a minute, a slight feeling of uneasiness came over the birthday celebrations. The urgent warning had made the men nervous, supposing something was in the air. However, a telephone inquiry to regimental headquarters and another to division yielded the reassuring reply, "Nothing doing, no alert." So they switched off the unintelligible Frenchman and let the champagne corks pop. June 6th was also the birthday of Sergeant Signaller Klaus Luke of the 22nd Panzer Regiment. His regiment belonged to the reconstituted 21st Panzer Division, that old elite unit of the Africa Corps which had remained behind in Tunisia. The 21st was the armoured unit nearest to the coast in Normandy. The division was still far from well equipped. The drivers were cursing the French tanks, which had to be specially fitted with radio equipment. The artillery troop had to practice with Russian anti-tank guns. Only slowly were the Mark V tanks with their 75 mm short and long barrel guns reaching the division. Conditions were no better with the grenadier regiments. Their fleet of vehicles was very modest, but at least they had the new Panzer AU, that bazooka-type grenade intended as an infantry weapon against armoured vehicles. The grenadiers were again able to do honour to their ancient name. "Our best weapons are our old corporals, sergeants, and non-commissioned officers," was a crack which Second Lieutenant Holler was inordinately fond of. He was an old Africa campaigner from the original 21st Panzer Division. He was now in charge of the heavy section of the company of the 192nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment, which was holding the area between Kay and the coast on the left bank of the River Ore. Many men of RL's Africa Corps who had survived the shambles and managed at the last minute to escape captivity in Tunisia were in the 21st Panzer Division. There were also Russian campaigners and old hands from Crete. They were a well-tried lot. Their divisional commander, Major General Finger, was at first in Rennes and later at Es-Pir-Suive, still a little too far in the rear for the liking of the old tank troopers, considering that the coastal area was to be the division's operational zone. Regimental headquarters of the 22nd Panzer Regiment, under Colonel von Opan-Bronowski, was at FES. The two tank battalions were fairly widely scattered along a line from T to Lyon. The companies were stationed in sleepy little villages among willow trees and apple orchards. Many of them realized that they were in an easy billet and knew how to organize their little pleasures. Others were kept under strict discipline and cursed their overzealous company commanders. Among the latter kind was the 4th Company under Captain Hoffmann at Epernay, 19 miles south of Kay. That night, Hoffmann had again laid on an extensive round of patrols. Corporal Heilig, on the other hand, who had fought in Africa with the legendary 361st, and had worked his way up from the despised position of a former foreign legionary to corporal, had an easier time in the 1st Company. "There's plenty of time for dying once the bullets start to fly. Until then, we'll live," was his motto. During the night of June 5th and 6th, he had therefore cycled from Versen to Car together with his friend Lance Corporal Britton. It turned out to be a most uncomfortable outing. Sergeant Sigaga Lick made his last check of the line to the regimental telephone exchange at 10:30 p.m. He too asked for any news and received the reply of an unsuspecting front. "Nothing special, Sergeant, apart from a few reports of enemy bombers approaching the coast." Leek said good night and went up to his room in the old chateau. There his apple brandy was waiting for him to be taken as a nightcap while he read a birthday letter from his wife, saved up until midnight. When he heard the midnight strike from the church tower of Fes, he downed 2 fingers of Calvados, opened his letter, and lay down on the old sofa. Dear Klaus, night lay over Normandy, a night without stars. Major Friedrich Hayne stepped out of 84th Corps headquarters in Es-Low into the small garden. For several hours he and his clerk had been busy drawing the situation maps which his chief, General of Artillery Erich Marx, wanted to take along with him to Rennes for the 7th Army's intended Kriegspiel. The subject of this map exercise was airborne landing parachute. General Mindel was to be in charge. It was an ironic twist of fate, an airborne landing as the subject of a Kriegspiel planned for an hour, when that very contingency would have become cruel reality, and just then the most important commanding officers would be away from their headquarters. Hayne's eyes swept over the deep-cut valley of the V, over the pastures and the orchards with their apple trees. The intelligence officer of the 84th Corps thought of Anlam, the small town where he had been the headmaster of the secondary school. His reverie was interrupted by a 4-engine bomber roaring low over the river from the nearby anti-aircraft gun emplacement on the tower of the local school. The 20 mm tracer shells streaked up into the night sky, straight into the bomber just above the clerical seminary of Agno. Above the west bank, the machine caught its packet. A burst of flame was followed by a crash like a solemn nail. The 12 strokes of midnight rang out from the cathedral. The major entered the bunker. The Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von Krian, and the Chief of Operations, Major Hasso Wieck, were already waiting for him. Here, too, a birthday was being celebrated. The general commanding the 84th Corps, General Marx, born on June 6, 1891, was 53. The celebration was brief. Marx, a brilliant officer of the old school, not greatly in favour with Oberkommando der Wehrmacht because of his earlier connections with General von Schleicher, but kept on the active list because of his great ability, was not given to celebrations. His meals were severely restricted to the official rations. Whereas an invitation to General von Schleben at the 709th Division headquarters was much appreciated by officers throughout the Corps, since Schleben had a reputation as a gourmet, there was no great rush to dine at Corps headquarters. This did not, in the least, impair General Marx's popularity, striking evidence of the man's personality. As the chimes rang out from the cathedral, the officers filed in to offer their good wishes. Standing, they drank a glass of sharbi. Then the general returned to his map table with creaking steps. He had lost a leg in Russia and wore an artificial limb. Marx, too, had been ordered by the 7th Army commander to attend the Kriegspiel in Rennes on June 6th. He wanted to be well briefed. "The maps, please," Hayne said to his intelligence officer. The major unfolded the situation maps. Enemy situation, air situation, special map showing own gun positions, map of minefields and flooded areas. The general kept thinking about the previous day's large-scale reconnaissance by the Allied air forces. Since 10 p.m., moreover, reports had been coming in about massive incursions despite the bad weather. What did it mean? That was the great secret. The secret whose solution had long been lying on the desks at Saint-Jean and La Rosconne, but it was not passed on to the commander of the key corps. While General Marx, at a slow pace, kept wondering about the enemy bomber formations, Admiral Henner in Korg was examining the incoming reports. Meanwhile, 2nd Lieutenant Jan at Strong Point Wien Nest, west of Esmer EES, was relaxing on his bunk, and Sergeant Signer Laik of the 22nd Panzer Regiment in FEs was sipping his Calvados. The officers of the 92nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment angrily switched off the British Broadcasting Corporation, and in the troop quarters along the Seigneur and Via Estes, the sentimental tune of Cute Little Bus Conductress was drowning the whine of the mosquitoes. The green light flashed on in the leading machine of the 82nd United States Airborne Division. Major General James Gavin glanced below him, then he jumped. His parachute opened with a jerk. The general could not see anything in the darkness, but he knew that at that very minute thousands of parachutes would be opening alongside him, behind him, right in the centre of the Conan Peninsula. Some 50 metres away, east of the Orne, British parachutists would at the same time be stepping out of their machines, and gliders would rush down to the ground with a swishing sound. An army was dropping out of the night sky. "They are coming," Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann had just glanced at his watch. The time was 40 minutes past midnight. June 6th was less than 3/4 of an hour old. For the past hour there had been a continuous drone of aircraft above the battle headquarters of the 3rd Battalion, 99th Grenadier Regiment, east of Montebourg. Another wave was approaching, and the roar grew louder. Hoffmann stepped outside the bunker and gave a start. 6 giant birds were making straight for his battle headquarters. They were clearly visible, for the moon had just broken through the clouds. "They're bailing out." For an instant, Hoffmann thought the aircraft had been damaged and its crew was going to jump, but then he understood this was an airborne landing by paratroops. The white mushrooms were floating down straight at his bunker. Alarm! Enemy parachutists! The men at 3rd Battalion headquarters had never pulled on their trousers so fast before. The sentries' carbines were barking as they fired at the parachutes floating down from the sky. Then the moon hid itself, and darkness enveloped the descending enemy. Hoffmann grabbed a rifle. The darkness was rent by the first burst of fire from an American submachine gun. The battle for Normandy was on. 50 miles southeast of the battle headquarters of 3rd Battalion, 919th Grenadier Regiment, on the far side of the Orne, things were also fairly noisy. The German sentry on the eastern end of the bridge over the Caen Canal at Benhoff jumped as, some 50 yards in front of his concrete sentry box, a spectral aircraft swooped towards the ground without any engine noise. A moment later there was a crash and a splintering sound, then quiet. The sentry snatched his carbine from his shoulder and loaded it. He held his breath, listening. A crashed bomber was his first thought. After all, enemy bomber formations had been roaring overhead from the coast for well over an hour. From the K direction came the noise of explosions. Anti-aircraft guns were barking from the neighbourhood of Troon. "They've had it," thought Private Wilhelm Ferner. Then a searing flash blinded his eyes. He no longer heard the burst of the phosphorus grenade. His comrades in the dugout by the approach to the bridge leapt up. They raced to their machine gun and fired a burst at random. They saw nothing. Suddenly they heard voices calling, "Able! Able!" They did not know that this was the recognition signal of a detail of a combat team of the 6th British Airborne Division, one of whose gliders had just crash-landed there in front of them. The Lance Corporal of the Guard was about to lift up the telephone to give the alarm to his platoon commander on the far side of the bridge, but there was no time. 2 hand grenades came sailing in through the aperture of the pillbox. Finished. It was a neat job, but then Major John Howard's men had practiced it long enough back in England. They had built a model of the bridge accurate down to the last details, which they had ascertained from air photographs and agent reports. For weeks throughout the spring, they rehearsed their attack on the bridge with a stopwatch. Everything went off perfectly, above all, the surprise. A detail cut the barbed wire at the approach to the bridge. There was no point now in keeping quiet. The hand grenades were bound to have roused the guard on the far side. With shouts of, "Able! Able!" the Tommies galloped across the bridge. They heard other gliders crashing and the rallying cries of B detail, "Baker! Baker!" and a moment later C detail as well, "Charlie! Charlie!" The German machine gun was blazing away over the bridge. The first Tommies were falling, but the bulk of them got through. After a short skirmish, the guard on the bridge was overwhelmed. The crossing of the Quai Canal at Benov was in British hands. Only Lance Corporal Weber got away. He tore through the village to the commandant. British parachutists have seized the canal bridge. What he did not know was that the nearby bridge over the Orne at Ronville had also been seized by men of the 5th British Parachute Brigade in a surprise attack. At the 2nd Battalion, 192nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment at Quiron, the field telephone rang. Launching immediate counterattack against enemy parachutists in Bénouville bridgehead. At the Dives Bridge, on the Varaville-Grandgout road, another sentry was peering into the night. The watch at the bridge was mounted by the 2nd Battalion, 744th Infantry Regiment, which was barely a platoon in strength. The men had every reason to curse the bridge. 4 weeks previously, the 3rd Battalion had organised a night exercise without warning neighbouring units and staged a dummy attack on the bridge. The sentry, of course, could not have known that the shots that suddenly came from the approach to the bridge were blanks. He had thought the balloon had gone up in earnest and opened up with his machine gun. There had been several wounded and 2 men killed. There was a terrible rumpus and some very unpleasant investigations. All that flashed through the mind of the sentry on the bridge when, shortly after midnight, he saw 3 men with blackened faces charge up the embankment was a sense of impending danger. "Silly fools," he called out contemptuously, but then he jumped too late. He was given no time to call out or scream. Without a sound, he collapsed, stabbed by a long paratroop knife. From then on, it was an easy matter for the Tommies. 5 minutes later, the bridge was blown sky high. The same thing happened at the bridge over the Dives at Roberhomme. Even the important bridge at Trouarne, which carried the main road from Caen to Rouen and Le Havre over the river, was blown up by sappers of Major Rosevier's combat team. It was exactly 1:11 a.m. when the field telephone rang on General Marx's desk at 84th Corps headquarters in Saint-Lô. Marx and his staff officers were still sitting over their maps. The general himself picked up the receiver, listened, raised his head, and motioned his chief of staff to listen in with him. The call was from the Chief of Operations, 716th Division. Hurriedly, the words tumbled out of the earpiece. "Enemy paratroops have landed east of the Orne estuary. Main area is Breville-Ronville and the northern edge of the forest of Bavant. Main objective, apparently, the Dives bridges and the crossings over the Orne. Countermeasures are in progress." The news had the effect of a thunderbolt. Was it the invasion, or were they merely strong liaison groups dropped to link up with the French resistance? These were the questions to be answered. After a little hesitation, Major Haynes shook his head. "Too close to our front line. The resistance people would never risk that." His conclusion was, "This is the invasion." General Marx nodded. "Let's wait and see." They were still arguing the pros and cons when Colonel Hayman, acting commander of the 709th Division, came through on the telephone. Enemy parachutists south of Saint-Germain-de-Varaville and at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. A second group west of the Carentan-Valognes main road on both sides of the Merderet River and on the road at Sainte-Mère-Église. Headquarters of 3rd Battalion, 919th Grenadier Regiment, holding prisoners from the 101st United States Airborne Division. The time was 1:45 a.m. 5 minutes later, at exactly 1:50 a.m., the telephones were also ringing in Paris, in a big block of flats on the Bois de Boulogne. The Chief of Operations of Naval Group West, Captain Wegener, summoned his officers to the Situation Room. "I think the invasion is here," he said calmly. Admiral Hoffmann, the Chief of Staff, did not even wait to dress. He grabbed a dressing gown and rushed into the Situation Room. The reports from the radar stations under Lieutenant von Willison were unanimous. A large number of blips on the screens. At first, the technicians thought the huge number of blips must be caused by some interference. There just could not be so many ships. But presently, no doubt was left. A vast armada must be approaching the Normandy coast. "This can only be the invasion fleet," Hoffmann concluded. He ordered, "Signal to Commander-in-Chief West. Signal to the Führer's headquarters. The invasion is on." But both in Paris and in Rastenburg, the news was received sceptically. "What, in this weather? Surely your technicians must be mistaken," and even the Chief of Staff of Commander-in-Chief West scoffed. "Maybe a flock of seagulls?" They still would not believe it, but the Navy was certain. Naval headquarters alerted all coastal stations and all naval forces in port. The invasion fleet is coming. At 84th Corps, likewise, all doubt had vanished. "Alarm coast," General Marx instructed his Chief of Operations, Wiebig. This was the code word for the invasion, and now everything proceeded smoothly, an operation rehearsed countless times. The Corps' alert was given over the service telephone, and the civilian telephone network was put out of action. Divisional staff officers everywhere rushed to their map tables. "Alarm! They are coming!" At regimental headquarters, sleepy sentries leapt to their feet. "Alarm!" Field telephones passed the signal on to battalions and batteries of artillery, thence to companies and troops, and down to the platoons in the foremost positions, on the coast, in strong points and dugouts. Field police combed the cafes and restaurants of Caen. "Come on, everybody, the balloon's gone up." Corporal Heilig and his friend Lance Corporal Brighton of the 22nd Panzer Regiment, who had managed to get out of Caen just before the bombing started, pedalled their bicycles furiously over farm tracks, past hedgerows and orchards, back to Versen. They got there just in time. Number 1 Company was falling in outside the church, and Number 4 Company in Epany was already getting their tanks out of their camouflaged positions. Corporal Weinz, whom Captain Hoffmann had sent out on night patrol with 5 men, was just returning as his tank was being manhandled onto the road at the edge of the little town. There was a curious reason for their rapid response to the alarm. Captain von Gottberg, the officer commanding the 1st Battalion, 22nd Panzer Regiment, had just stretched out on his bunk when his telephone tinkled. He wondered why it did not ring properly, but nevertheless picked up the receiver. Thus he eavesdropped on a conversation between his regimental commander, von Oppeln-Bronikowski, and the divisional commander. General Feuchtinger was passing on to Oppeln the alarm ordered by Corps. Gottberg was up at once and mobilized his companies. Thus, the 1st Battalion, 22nd Panzer Regiment, was ready to move within a very short time. They were now standing by for orders. The 2nd Battalion did not have to be roused from sleep. Major Wierzig was on the move with his tanks towards the starting line of an exercise scheduled for the morning of June 6th, east of Falaise, naturally with blank ammunition. He received the alarm by dispatch rider, sent his companies back to their quarters to draw live ammunition, and then he too stood by. The entire 22nd Panzer Regiment, with 120 tanks, was standing by, ready to move off and ready for action. It was close behind the British dropping zone, where the Tommies were still blowing up or capturing bridge after bridge, occupying crossroads and establishing themselves in tactically important positions. "Lieutenant, let me see your hands." Second Lieutenant Arthur Janke, in Strong Point No. 5, Widerstands Nest 5 for short, on the eastern coast of the Cotentin Peninsula in the sector of the 709th Division, could not sleep. The ceaseless drone of aircraft had made him jumpy. He stepped out of the stone building of the strong point and looked up at the overcast sky. He could hear bomb bursts and anti-aircraft fire in the distance, and a continuous rumble above the clouds. Janke rang up the neighbouring strong point, Widerstands Nest 2. Second Lieutenant Ritter answered the telephone. He too could not sleep. "I have a feeling that something's up," he said. "But nothing that concerns us," replied Janke. "I hope you're right," said Ritter. "I'll come and have a lot of your cognac tomorrow just to prove I was right." Janke ended the conversation. "Well, that's one free drink," he thought to himself, smiling. He was not to know that his patch of dune, surrounded by barbed wire and held by a platoon of 3rd Company, 919th Grenadier Regiment, would within a matter of hours assume historic significance as the spot where the Americans first set foot on the soil of France in the struggle for Europe. Once more Janke turned towards the sea and listened. "Low water," he said, "and they would not come at low water." That he had straight from the horse's mouth, from Rommel in person. When the Field Marshal had inspected Strong Point Widerstands Nest on May 11th, he had been far from cheerful. The sector held by the division did not seem to him sufficiently fortified. There were not enough ramming blocks and pile barriers dug into the foreshore. Not enough Czech hedgehogs had been laid. Not enough asparagus driven into the ground to protect clearings and fields against airborne landings. Rommel's bad temper was unloaded on von Schlieben, the divisional commander, on Lieutenant Colonel Kiel, the 919th Regiment's commander, and even on Lieutenant Matz, the company commander. Rommel's famous sense of humour, his persuasive arguments which usually fired the enthusiasm of officers and other ranks, his inspiring vision, none of these had been in evidence. He had not even handed out cigarettes. Only Janke, who had won the Knight's Cross as a platoon leader in Russia, and who had arrived at the Western Front as a result of a wound and subsequent posting to a reserve unit, had refused to be intimidated. He had reported to the Field Marshal about their fortification work, and pointed out that with every spring tide the Czech hedgehogs and the mined stakes were washed up again. "Barbed wire obstacles in depth? Such wire as we get is used for obstacles," Janke said, pointing to the wire hedges built in accordance with his experience from Russia. But the Field Marshal's anger was too deep-seated. "Let me see your hands for a minute, Lieutenant," he said suddenly. Second Lieutenant Janke, a man of 23, was a little taken aback. But an order was an order. He stripped off his grey suede gloves and held out his hands to the Field Marshal. They were torn, with bloody scratches and calluses. The lieutenant had learned in Russia that an officer lends a hand with the laying of wire obstacles every bit as much as a private. Indeed, over here in the West, he had demonstratively done his share, for the long years of occupation in France had not exactly engendered much enthusiasm for fortification work among the German units. The sight of Janke's hands had robbed Rommel of his last chance to vent his anger. He nodded. "Well done, Lieutenant. The blood on an officer's hands from fortification work is worth every bit as much as that shed in battle." The second lieutenant with the Knight's Cross, who had only newly arrived from the Eastern Front, had uttered his regulation Jawohl and had kept his thoughts to himself. If only the men were given proper instruction in fortification work. But many elderly reserve officers, whose active service experience dated from the First World War, were still building 1917-type positions. Janke had frequently been exasperated by it, and not only by the fortification work. He had discovered to his amazement that the French fishermen were authorized to stroll along the macadamized road right through his strongpoint on their way down to the shore. Janke forbade it, but the village commandant in the rear shook his head, saying that the new chap was taking everything too seriously. Those decent local people, why shouldn't they fish? When Janke actually got his guns to open fire one night as a practice alarm, the whole of regimental headquarters was in a flap, saying jokingly that Ivan had clearly gone off his rocker. Just couldn't wait for the show to start, But Yankee grinned and went on practicing and building fortifications in accordance with the field marshal's instructions. Even though the increasingly heavy air raids left little doubt as to what would become of the magnificent and laboriously constructed positions with their trenches and wire obstacles if a bomb carpet were laid over them, the effect could be studied in detail at 1st Battery, 1261st Army Coastal Artillery Regiment, under Lieutenant Urban outside Saint-Martin-de-Varaville. Not a stone had been left standing there. The position, complete with all its guns, had been pulverized. "Wouldn't be so funny if they caught us," Sergeant Hine had said to Junker. Since then, they had been really afraid of the nightly bomber incursions, which were getting heavier all the time. The troops, of course, would not believe that anything could go wrong. After all, their strongpoint looked well fortified from the crest of the dunes, the impressive 88mm gun, the bunkers with their flanking 50mm guns, the 75mm anti-tank gun, and the machine gun nests, the flamethrowers, and the Goliaths. Why, even the Feldkanone 16, the field gun from the First World War, positively radiated military prowess. Surely they won't walk smack into a fortress, the men were saying. Yankee did not think so either, and he returned to his quarters in the stone building. He curled up on his camp bed and lit a cigarette, thinking of Russia. He was glad to be in France. They even had a shower next door, though it was just a watering can cunningly rigged to the ceiling. The telephone rang. Yankee lifted the receiver and leapt up from his bed. The battalion was passing on the alarm. The message added, "Enemy parachutists probably dropping behind your position also. Alarm, action stations, double sentries along the strongpoint perimeter. Patrol to move off at once to reconnoitre the situation. Probably an operation in support of the French resistance," said Sergeant Hine. True, he had not yet come across a single armed resistance man, but there was a lot of talk about their secret army. Yankee agreed with him. There was a good reason why the big invasion need not be expected that day. "When they come, it will be at high water," Rommel had said to him during a recent inspection. It seemed to stand to reason. At high water, the landing craft could run up right against the base of the dunes, close to the barbed wire. At low water, on the other hand, every attacker would have to cross some 800 yards of perfectly flat beach. 800 yards, in the face of machine guns and anti-tank guns, not to mention the mortars. They would come at high water, but now the tide had just turned and was running out. It seemed unthinkable that paratroops would open the invasion at that moment. It didn't make sense, hence this was not the big landing operation. Those were Yankee's thoughts as he stood waiting. Half an hour later, the carbines and machine guns opened up among the flooded fields at his rear. It was the patrol. They had run into 24 American paratroopers who had tried to work their way across the swamp. The poor wretches were up to their waists in the water, as the machine gun bursts spattered around them. The first few dropped, the others raised their hands. With 19 prisoners, the leader of the patrol returned to the strongpoint, hands above their heads, faces to the wall. The lance corporal ordered the captured Americans to line up inside the stone building. The prisoners were frisked, and all their belongings were closely examined. Their 2 wounded, whom the Americans had carried in with them, were taken to the first aid post in the bunker. Yankee immediately rang battalion headquarters, reporting 19 prisoners of the American 2nd Battalion, 506 Parachute Regiment. He was about to add, "of the 101st Airborne Division," when the line clicked and went dead. The underground cable, which had only recently been laid by French workers under the supervision of German engineers, had been cut. W5 had contact only with its neighbouring strongpoints to the right and left. Corporal Hoffman of the Medical Corps was meanwhile giving first aid to a seriously wounded man of colour. The poor man must have been in terrible pain. He had been shot through the chin. Hoffman nodded to him reassuringly. "You'll be all right." The black man looked terrified. The corporal turned to his medicine box and met the eyes of a slightly wounded lieutenant. The lieutenant grinned and, in fairly good German, said, "You are in the Medical Corps and you carry a pistol. That's against the rules." Hoffman, like Yankee, was an old hand from Russia, and on the Russian front, every member of the medical corps carried a pistol. It was more effective protection than an armband with a red cross. Hoffman realized at once that the American officer was right. "Maybe it's also against the rules that I'm bandaging you in spite of my pistol," he grumbled. At that moment, Janke entered the bunker and heard the last few words. "What's up, Hoffman? He's complaining about my pistol?" Janke glanced at the enemy officer. "You're quite right," he said, and turning to the corporal he added, "Take your cannon off, Hoffman." The corporal took off his holster belt, grinning. "Let's hope the bombs remember that I'm in the medical corps." They did not remember. Corporal Hoffman of the medical corps was killed shortly afterward. Janke had a troop bunker cleared in the dunes farther back and ordered his prisoners to be taken there. The door was barred and a guard was mounted outside. At 2:45 a.m., Corporal Hoffman came up to Janke. "The wounded are curiously restless. They keep wanting to know the time and when they're going to be moved." The guard outside the bunker with the prisoners likewise reported that the two officers in particular demanded to be moved. "I wonder what the hurry is," Janke asked. "Maybe they don't like it here," the guard said, grinning. "Or maybe something else is due to happen yet, Herr Leutnant." By daybreak, the 84th Corps realized that the airborne landings were no second-rate operation, no commando raid, and no bluff. Reports showed that entire divisions had landed on both flanks of the Corps' area. To the right of the Orne and Dives, in the sector of the 716th and 711th Divisions, the 6th British Airborne Division had been identified. On the left, in the sector of the 709th Division, the 82nd and 101st United States Airborne Divisions had been identified in the strength of 4 regiments. The combat teams were trying to gain control of the principal bridges and roads across the flooded area to the hinterland in order to seal off the coast from all possible supplies and from support by tactical reserves. In a few places they had succeeded in this. This could no longer be taken lightly. This was deadly serious. The airdrops evidently represented a bold strategic operation to protect the flanks of an impending seaborne landing between the estuaries of Orne and Veer. The conclusions of the 84th Corps were correct. D-Day had come. The greatest amphibian operation in history was being preceded by the most adventurous, spectacular, but also the costliest air operation. Altogether, 9,210 aircraft, not including bombers and reconnaissance planes, left England during the night of June 5 to 6, 1944. For 2.5 hours without pause, the immense air armada passed over London. The coastal front was spluttering with bomb bursts. Over Caen, hell was let loose. Bridges, roads, and especially airfields in the French hinterland were under a ceaseless hail of bombs. Vast fleets of gliders sailed through the air. Everything had been accurately calculated, worked out in detail, and rehearsed. A great deal went according to plan, but not everything. The Americans dropped 2 airborne divisions, 17,000 elite troops with field guns and armor-piercing weapons, behind the German line on the Cotentin Peninsula. Their objective was to establish a strong position in depth behind the German coastal line of the 709th Division, to keep open the exits through the artificially flooded areas, and to cut off the German 91st Air Landing Division from the American beachheads. Moreover, communications were to be cut, roads and bridges blocked, and the German coastal front cut off from supplies and reinforcements. But the gigantic airborne landing operation was launched under an unlucky star. Heavy, low-lying clouds prevented the pilots of the advanced formations from making an accurate approach. The glider formations, too, were broken up. That was the beginning of the disaster. The objectives of the drops were the bridges and causeways in the flooded areas of the Meurderet River along the road from Sainte-Mère-Église to Pont-l'Abbé. If the men jumped half a minute too soon or late, they would land in the swamps or in the water. That was precisely what happened. The 507th Regiment, without exception, jumped right into the middle of the flooded area. The grass grew so thick upon the swampy ground that, looking down from the air, one might well believe it to be a lush meadow. But a man coming down by parachute with 70 pounds of equipment on his back would be swallowed up at once. Only a few succeeded in getting out of the bog. The regiment's heavy equipment was lost entirely, and wounded men drowned helplessly. Crash-landing gliders vanished with men and equipment. General James Gavin, the 36-year-old commander of the 82nd Airborne Division's parachute assault, also stepped out into the void. While over the Channel, he had seen the machines of his advanced formations and had known 7,000 men to be behind him. Over the Channel Islands, however, they had run into flak, and presently low cloud had slid between aircraft and ground like thick porridge. At the last moment, Gavin's machine got a clear view. Below him, the general saw a glittering sheet of water. He heaved a sigh of relief. The Douve. The green light, the signal for jumping, flashed on. He drew a deep breath and stepped out, but like the general and his pilot, nearly the whole armada had made a mistake. The 507th Regiment had dropped into the flooded area along the Meurderet and waded through the swamp. Some men lay drowned in the ditches, others blundered about the banks of the river looking for the bridge they were to have secured. Only one thing went right. The little town of Sainte-Mère-Église fell to Gavin's men. A German anti-aircraft transport unit stationed there withdrew after a brief skirmish with a few scattered detachments of the 505th Parachute Regiment, which had dropped right in the middle of the town, abandoning the important township en route nationale, the road from Cherbourg via Carentan to Paris. This blunder of a flak lieutenant had far-reaching consequences, presenting the American airborne landing operation with its first decisive success. General Taylor's 101st Airborne Division was not much luckier than General Ridgway's 82nd. It lost 30% of its strength and 70% of its equipment in the landing. Rommel's asparagus, the stakes he had ordered to be driven into the ground, were the doom of countless gliders. They were impaled and splintered. They dug their noses into gardens and fields. They crashed into hedgerows and sunken lanes. In small groups, the various units tried to reach their operational areas or the coastline, fought running engagements with German patrols, attacked villages and headquarters, took prisoners or were taken prisoner. The heavy naval coastal battery of Saint-Marcoux was an important pivot of the German defences on the east coast of the Cherbourg Peninsula. It had been planned as a showpiece of the Atlantic Wall and was intended for use against naval targets. Its equipment included 4 210mm long-barreled guns, 6 75mm anti-aircraft guns, and 1 150mm gun. Unfortunately, this powerful barrier behind the beach of La Madeleine was not yet ready on June 6th. Nevertheless, the 400 naval gunners and their equipment represented a considerable defensive power against attacks from the sea. The first gun emplaced in the bunker had been ranged on April 19th. Its roar was heard far and wide, the foundations held, and the men nodded. On the following day, the war began in earnest for the battery. Every evening, the bombers came over from England out of the setting sun and made straight for their positions. They dropped their bombs into the churned-up nests of the craters, but the 400 men of Saint-Marcoux, a motley crowd from many units, most of them over 38, were gradually developing a stubborn esprit de corps. In spite of the air raids, they continued to fortify their positions. They planted asparagus, uncoiled barbed wire, built bunkers, and laid belts of mines on the dunes, covering them with esparto grass. They toiled hard in the sunlit coastal landscape, with the sea breeze fanning their faces. The roar of the breakers came from below the bluff. "Get a move on there! Get a move on!" was the sergeant's never-varying refrain. Get a move on. But despite it all, they did not get enough concrete, ammunition, or steel loophole flaps for the bunker openings, and they had no swivelling armoured cupolas or modern fire control instruments. "Let's hope the enemy waits until we are ready," tall Corporal Hermann Nissen used to say every evening. He was not to know that the enemy, across the Channel in England, was waiting for only 2 things, the right moon and a suitable tide. At last, the moment came. On the evening of June 5, 1944, the sun set without the customary simultaneous call of enemy aircraft. It was the first evening in weeks without enemy bombers. With a sigh of relief, the men went to their quarters in the little town of Saint-Marcoux and the village of Crisbec. This had been the normal routine since April 19th, as the bunkers at the gun position offered room and cover only for the crews of the two fully installed guns and the anti-aircraft guns. The sentry took up his position in a sheltered corner of the bunker. A faint drone was audible from afar. Carl Sello cupped his right hand over the bowl of his pipe, took a puff, and luxuriously blew the smoke into the night air. It was 11 p.m. In another hour he would be relieved. But what was that drone over to the west? Surely those fellows were not suddenly coming from a different direction. It would be a damned nuisance, especially as the night had started so peacefully. Enemy aircraft. It was them, after all. The drone swelled to a deafening roar. Thus began the worst night Saint-Marcoux ever experienced. Over 100 aircraft attacked the position. According to official Allied records, 600 tons of bombs were dropped on the battery site. The onslaught lasted 35 minutes. All 6 anti-aircraft guns were smashed, and the ground was ploughed over. Shortly after midnight, a runner from the little chateau of Saint-Marcoux burst into Omsen's battle headquarters. He was breathless and shaken. Herr Oberleutnant, direct hit on the chateau. The quarters are wrecked. Lots of men are buried. The ruins are burning. There are many dead and wounded. Omsen was worried. That was the last straw. Oberleutnant Grieg, he said to his gun position officer. Take all available men, get them to draw spades and shovels and hurry up. We can't afford any losses now. Lieutenant Grieg wasted no time in telling his men to fall in. Helter-skelter, they rushed out into the night with spades and shovels, but they did not get far. Back at the battery, the men were trying to patch up 2 damaged anti-aircraft guns when Grieg's men returned. What's up? Grieg rushed over to Omsen. Herr Oberleutnant, we came under fire, I presume, from enemy paratroops. Paratroops? Omsen was doubtful. Get a fighting patrol ready. Oberleutnant Grieg will lead the patrol. Under him, 2 non-commissioned officers and 20 men. Weapons, submachine guns and hand grenades. The first hour of June 6, 1944, that historic and bloody Tuesday, had begun also at Saint-Marcoux. Cautiously, the men picked their way through the darkness. Silence. Only here and there came the croaking of a frog from the marshes. A short distance away, 2 other frogs answered. Yet another was croaking quite vigorously next to Lance Corporal Albert Müller. Strange, Lieutenant Grieg reflected. He had never known so many frogs there before. The patrol fanned out. At the same instant, things began happening on the right wing. Halt! Came the voice of the end man of the line. Then a crash and a groan. Grieg rushed over. What's going on here? He whispered. An American, came the lowered voice reply, and there he lay on the ground. Hermann and Müller had got him. He had used a kind of toy snapper to croak like a frog, evidently the recognition signal for his comrades. On hearing the German challenge, he had tried to escape, but Müller had hit him over his tin helmet with his submachine gun. He was now kneeling by him. He picked up the tin snapper and pressed it. Croak, it went. Müller pressed it again. Croak. The signal was answered from the swamp. That was when their ruse was conceived. They went on pressing the snapper, silently stalking the answering frogs, and picking up one American after another from the swamp until there were no frogs left to croak. Towards 1:30 a.m., the patrol returned to base without losses. Each man had brought a frog with him. They had taken 20 prisoners, a truly impressive haul. Croak, croak, Lieutenant Grieg said, chuckling. Then they locked up the 20 Americans in an empty bunker. The prisoners belonged to 5 transport units of the 502 United States Parachute Regiment. Among them were the company commander and the complete company headquarters personnel. The remaining 100 men, who had fought their way through the swamp as far as Saint-Marcoux or had come down in the middle of the village, were now trying to reform for an attack on the battery position. Interrogation of the prisoners revealed that the combat group had had the task of occupying Lieutenant Urban's gun position, 1261, near Saint-Martin de Varaville, 4 miles farther west, behind Strongpoint WS. Either in error or because it had seemed easier, they had decided to attack Saint-Marcoux instead. The orderly officer of 2nd Battalion, 919th Infantry Regiment, with a hastily formed assault team of 8 men, had forced the Americans out of Saint-Marcoux and driven them off the road back into the pathless swamp. Omerson and his officers were wide-eyed with amazement when they saw the equipment taken from the prisoners. Tiny walkie-talkie sets in the shape of pocket torches, compasses as tunic buttons, the New Testament on India paper, and silk scarves with maps printed on them. Most interesting of the lot were the maps. Even the fields in the hinterland where Rommel's asparagus had been planted only a few days before were accurately marked. But that was not all. Omerson had never computed the exact map coordinates of his machine gun posts, yet the Americans had accurately surveyed them by aerial photography and plotted them on their silk maps. Omerson and his men had a foreboding of more surprises to come. 2.5 miles farther inland, at the neighbouring strongpoint of Azeville, things were rather lively at the 9th Battery, 945th Army Coastal Artillery Regiment, with its 4 122mm guns in their fortress-type emplacements. Lieutenant Katnig, the gun position officer and strongpoint commander, was busy writing a letter in his bunker when the air raid alarm was given by the flak post. He rushed outside his bunker and was amazed to see an armada of transport aircraft spewing out parachutists. "All weapons, fire!" Katnig raced over to the command post, but before him, in the most literal sense, a man dropped out of the sky. Katnig whipped out his pistol and stepped on the shroud lines. The man seemed dazed and raised his arms. An American officer. He refused to answer questions. In sullen silence, he let himself be locked in a bunker. At the same moment, firing broke out outside the barbed wire surrounding the post. Katnig was no longer able to get through to division by direct wire. He had to make his report via the observer post situated at the Saint-Marcoux battery. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Hans-Jörg Habel of the neighbouring battery arrived with a handful of men. His battery was in field positions, and the airdrop had been right among their tents. His men had been overwhelmed by the Americans. Habel's account did not exactly make the men of Azeville feel friendly. "They won't get in here," Sergeant Louis Schillerger declared emphatically. Merville, a costly mistake. The British too had their Saint-Marcoux. Its name was Merville. In December 1943, when Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway was first summoned by his divisional commander, General Richard Gale, he had never heard the name of Merville, but before long he became as familiar with the village as if he had spent his whole life there. At Merville, east of the Orne, 1.5 miles from the coast, was a battery of the 1716th Artillery Regiment, with a complement of 130 men. On the strength of agents' reports, Allied intelligence had concluded that this battery was equipped with 150mm guns and hence represented a serious threat to the planned seaborne landing of the 3rd British Division in the Ouistreham-Lyon area. The battery must fall before the landing, was the order. Considerable machinery was set in motion to silence Merville before the seaborne landing began. That was the task to be accomplished by Lieutenant Colonel Otway with the 9th Parachute Battalion of the 6th British Airborne Division. The operation was a battle in its own right. It was lavish in effort, costly, and essentially pointless, but it has been much quoted in military history and is still receiving a good deal of prominence in the most recent British and American publications. It therefore deserves closer study. The general plan was as follows. Otway's reinforced battalion, about 750 men, was to drop between Merville and Gonneville shortly before 1 a.m., meet at predetermined rendezvous points, and then take the strong point according to an exact timetable. The execution had been worked out with loving care, rather like some modern battle between cowboys and Red Indians. Its climax was to be the landing of an assault force of 60 men by gliders right on top of the battery, at the very moment the attack was mounted from outside. Aerial reconnaissance had shown the strongpoint to be surrounded by a barbed wire hedge 15 feet thick and 5 feet high. In front of that was a wide minefield, and in front of that were more barbed wire obstacles. And, as if that was not enough, there was another minefield 100 yards deep and surrounded by wire. The defence post included one-man foxholes and connected beach trenches. Of the 4 gun bunkers, only the easternmost, number 4, was equipped for close combat defence. The battery was protected by automatic weapons. An automatic 20mm gun stood on the roof of one of the pillboxes, right in the centre of the battery. It was intended for action against air and ground targets. According to the Allied plan, the position was to be eliminated at all costs before the seaborne landing. Lieutenant Colonel Otway was therefore ordered to take the battery by 5:15 a.m. at the latest. If he did not succeed, the Navy would start shelling the position at 5:15 a.m., which showed the importance attached to Merville. The position of the battery at a crossroads on open ground made effective camouflage difficult. The massive anti-tank ditch marked out the post unambiguously for Allied air reconnaissance. Through repeated aerial photography, they kept tabs on the progress of fortification work. When, towards the end of March, the photographs showed 2 of the gun bunkers completed and the other 2 under construction, a systematic and wasteful aerial bombardment began. It is worth noting that of roughly 1,000 bomb bursts, only 50 lay within the battery territory, and no more than 2 hit the intended targets, the gun emplacements. Neither of them achieved penetration. This was an instructive illustration of the high cost and small return of carpet bombing of reinforced concrete objectives in open ground. Lieutenant Colonel Otway was 29. His battalion of 35 officers and 600 men had the reputation of an elite unit. It was reinforced by a company of picked, battle-seasoned Canadian parachutists, totaling 750 men. For 2 months, by the sweat of their brows, Otway's men practiced the attack. They built a model that included even the cows, where every farm track had been correctly scooped out by bulldozer. They practiced and practiced, by day and by night, the same operation over and over again, the full, complicated sequence of actions. Every man knew his functions and each of his movements. The reconnaissance teams, the taping party with their mine detectors, who were to mark out the cleared path through the minefield and wire, the breaching teams who were to clear passages through the obstacles, and the assault force to be landed from 3 gliders inside the strongpoint at the exact moment of the rush from outside, and who were to take the guns by surprise. In addition, there were 2 reconnaissance teams with 2 German-speaking non-commissioned officers tasked with causing confusion by misleading commands. The equipment was as lavish as the planning. All the weapons and equipment of technical warfare were employed: flamethrowers, anti-tank guns, radio jeeps, scaling ladders, assault demolition charges, special explosive sticks, an ambulance, microphones and loudspeakers. To wear down the German defenders and extensively damage the obstacles even before the attack, especially to render the minefields ineffective, 109 heavy Lancaster bombers were scheduled to bomb the battery between 12:30 a.m. and 12:40 a.m. A total of 382 tons of bombs, including blockbusters of nearly 2 tons, were to crush the fortifications, with the airborne landing then to be made under the protection of this aerial bombardment. While the battalion rallied, the so-called taping party was to advance with the mine-clearing party, clearing and marking out 3 paths through the minefield. The leader of the reconnaissance team was instructed to keep the battalion commander at the landing point informed about the situation. The signal for the attack was a bugle call, and for identification, each member of the assault parties had a luminous skull and crossbones painted on his chest. The most detailed timetable was for the glider bomb assault force, and looked like this. 3:24 a.m. At 6,000 feet above the German battery, the tow plane will cast off the glider with the assault party and flash a light signal. 3:25 a.m. to 3:30 a.m. At the bugle call, Reveille, a mortar will fire star shells towards the battery position to facilitate landing. 3:28 a.m. At the call Fall In, all fire will cease, with the exception of the star shells and the fire of the diversion team. 3:30 a.m. At the call Lights Out, firing of star shells will cease, the first glider will land, and the charges in the obstacles will be detonated. That was the plan, and this is how it went in practice. Shortly before midnight, the landing and reconnaissance parties took off from England. In front of them roared the Lancaster bombers, but the very first item on the programme went wrong. The aerial bombardment of the battery missed its target. Instead of the guns and the minefields, the village of Gonneville was reduced to ruins. The reconnaissance party dropped right among the bombs and only just escaped annihilation. Lieutenant Colonel Otway and the main section had no inkling of the disaster. They felt sure that after all their trouble and planning, nothing could go seriously wrong. But they soon found out that they had overlooked one small point, that the Germans would shoot back, and that was precisely what happened. They opened up with 88mm flak, and many of the pilots took drastic evasive action. The paratroops with their heavy loads tumbled about in the machines like 9 pins. There was a good deal of confusion in the transports. Not without difficulty did the men get out of their machines. Others flew too far to the east, and several aircraft missed the dropping zone altogether. The glider with the heavy special equipment had torn loose from its hawser while over the channel and had crashed. Widely scattered, the parachutists reached the ground, with the last of them as much as 30 miles from their target. Only very few came down on the scheduled dropping point. Lieutenant Colonel Otway had made a good landing, but had to wait in vain for his battalion. After an hour and a half, 150 men had at last assembled, only 150 out of 750, so 600 were missing. Nevertheless, Otway decided to attack, a testimony to the man's toughness, courage, and discipline. Naturally, the whole plan had to be scrapped. The course of action was now dictated by realities. From the available strength, 2 groups of 15 men each were formed to breach the obstacles. 4 assault teams of 12 men each were then to storm the position. They had cautiously assembled in a ditch on the edge of a cornfield, 500 yards from the battery post. The time was 3:30 a.m. At the battery command post, the alert of the divisional artillery commander had long been received. The battery commander and gun position officer had doubled the sentries. Before long, they spotted movements outside the perimeter. The alarm was sounded throughout the position, and the battery's machine guns began to stutter. At that moment, the gliders with the assault force came flying in. The towing planes flashed their lights to signal the casting off of the hawsers. Noiselessly, the gliders wheeled down to the ground. One of them skimmed over the battery position at a height of 100 feet, and 20mm flak opened up from the roof of a crew bunker. The tracer went straight into the belly of the glider. Smoke poured out, the big bird swerved, and crashed a long way off in the fields. Now the second glider came into sight. Since Otway had no mortars to light up the battery area, the pilot mistook the village still burning from the bombing raid for the landing point and set down its party some 4 miles from their objective. Of the third glider there was no trace at all. It had made a forced landing on the wrong side of the channel, still over England. Thus the final surprise assault was off. Otway therefore ordered his men to attack. Explosive charges were flung into the obstacles, and the assault parties advanced on the strongpoint, firing all their weapons. The long period of waiting and the ceaseless alerts had blunted the caution of the German garrison at Merville as well. The main entrance to the battery site was only skimpily barricaded, which allowed a small British party to penetrate rapidly into the battery. At the same moment, Corporal Windgasson arrived at the strongpoint entrance with a reconnaissance unit of army flak. The 20mm flak troop had run straight into the British airborne landings on its way from Franceville to Caen. The troop leader had decided to make for Merville. With 5 men, Windgasson had gone ahead to reconnoitre. Meeting British troops at the barrier, they were so much taken by surprise that all they could do was raise their arms. Corporal Kurt Richter of the Medical Corps found a lot of work waiting for him. From the bunker where Windgasson and his men were lying together with the British wounded, they could hear the noise of battle in the strongpoint. Their German comrades were engaging the British assault party from the glider that had crash-landed behind the position. In the trenches and dugouts, the artillerymen were engaged in bloody hand-to-hand fighting with the attackers. 2 of the gun bunkers had their rearward steel bulkheads open, so that the British only had to fling in their demolition charges. It was all over in 30 minutes. Otway's men were victorious. 22 Germans, all of them wounded, were marched out as prisoners from the position. The remaining men, about 100, had been killed in the fighting. Of Otway's 150 men, 66 lay dead on the battlefield. It was a dearly bought victory, and with victory came the terrible revelation. The Merville battery did not have any 150mm guns. After all, it had only 75mm field guns, which would not have constituted any serious threat to a British seaborne landing. For shelling targets at sea, it was not suitable at all. The intended British landing beach was not even visible from the battery, and with its firing range of 4 miles, it could have opened only indirect fire on the easternmost part of the beach. An error of magnificent magnitude, had guided the planners of the operation against Merville. As so often in war, the entire costly enterprise had been just an error. In the landward direction, the guns could not fire at all from their emplacements, unless, of course, they were dragged out of their bunkers. The whole position was equipped only for defence against a tank attack from the seaward side. Yet another mistake upset the calculations of the British planners. After the capture of the battery, Lieutenant Colonel Otway fired the prearranged signal to indicate that the battery had fallen. However, he received no confirmation that his signal had been understood by the reconnaissance aircraft. He therefore withdrew from the position so as not to become a victim of his own side's naval bombardment. Presently, a German combat group of the 736th Grenadier Regiment recaptured Merville by a counterattack. It turned out that in the excitement, the British had not wrecked the guns as thoroughly as they might have. The equipment was by no means entirely useless, and makeshift repairs were put in hand at once. On the following day, June 7th, the German grenadiers defended the battery against a British commando party, which had orders to mop up the area. They resisted stubbornly, but were overcome. A renewed German counterattack, supported by self-propelled guns, again brought the strongpoint under German control. Until the beginning of July, it would change its occupants several more times. It was hotly contested and drenched with blood, for in war one costly mistake begets a dozen others. W5 joins action. Dawn was breaking, and the hedgerows of Cotentin and the orchards of Calvados were emerging from darkness. But one could not trust any hedgerow, any orchard, or any cornfield. Scattered paratroops were lying in their hideouts, keeping out of sight. Stray patrols from various German reserve battalions in the dropping zones near Sainte-Mère-Église and in the area of Ranville, east of the Orne, were mounting posts in cornfields and outside villages. "Come on, step on it," Major General Falley said to his driver. "It's nearly daylight." "We're practically there," Herr General, Major Bartuzat assured him. They were racing along the Coutances-Perrier-Etionville road, back to where they had started from. 6 hours earlier, General Falley and his supply officer had set out from the 91st Air Landing Division headquarters at Picauville, so as to get to Rennes in time for the 7th Army's Kriegspiel. The ceaseless stream of bombers overhead had worried the general. An experienced instructor at the military academy and a front-line officer, he felt that these sorties against the hinterland did not bode well.